Just before World War II started, the US Navy recognized the need for a new generation of carrier-based fighters and put out several RFPs for new designs. Well, after troublesome early combat experience against the A6M0, the need for new fighters gained a little bit more urgency. The F4U Corsair project was being developed by the Vought company to meet one of those earlier RFPs, and contained a lot of innovations. The most distinctive feature was an inverted gull wing to allow for a huge engine with a large propeller, while still giving ground clearance and folding wings for carrier service. The plane was still in development when Pearl Harbor happened, but it was already showing enormous potential, and the early prototypes were breaking records and impressing test pilots on a regular basis. However, with a cutting-edge design comes cutting-edge problems, and there were an enormous number of issues that needed to be resolved before the new plane could be put into service. During the early development phases, its armament was upgraded, the cockpit was moved further back, the landing gear and tailhook went through multiple changes, and there were major problems with asymmetrical low-speed stall performance, especially on landing. It took a while for these issues to get fixed, but in mid-1942, the first batch of early model F4Us were delivered for service, and by early 1943, the Corsair's huge leap in capabilities over other fighters was obvious. Thanks to combat reports from the US Marine Corps, the plane gained new support from the US Navy's senior brass, and upgraded versions were put into service as fast as they could be built. Corsairs gained a legendary reputation in the Pacific Air War, racking up a kill ratio of greater than 10-to-1 in air combat, with some historians considering it the best carrier-based prop fighter ever built. The F4U-4 was the last model to see combat during World War II, and it entered service in early 1945. It primarily featured some engine upgrades, but also had newer electronics and radio equipment installed. Later models of the F4U actually served into the 1960s, but those are stories for later reviews. The plane we're looking at in War Thunder is the F4U-4 Corsair, a naval fighter in Rank 3 of the American Tech Tree at Battle Rating 4.3. The plane's primary armament is a set of 6 12.7mm M2 Browning machine guns with a good selection of ammo belts. My general preference for air combat for these guns is the universal belt, but some players swear by the tracer belts, so I'd say give both a try and see what works best for you. Either way, you get a huge supply of ammunition. For loadouts, you can take a few sizes of dumb bombs or a bunch of unguided rockets. The air-to-ground weapons on this plane are all perfectly credible for doing, like, strike fighter stuff, and the pair of 1,000-pound bombs are especially lethal to ground targets. The flight performance of the F4U-4 is just outstanding for its BR. This plane has a really good rate of climb, and if you maintain a speed of about 275 kilometers an hour while you're going up, you won't have any trouble getting up there for bomber interception, or setting yourself up to dive on enemy fighters at lower altitudes. In level flight, the Corsair is incredibly fast, with good acceleration and top-end speed. Only a small number of planes at its BR will be able to keep up with it, and its really strong engine power ends up being a huge advantage. You can use WEP to boost this even a little bit further, but if you're not running manual engine controls, just keep an eye out on your temps, and don't hesitate to let off the throttle a little bit now and then. Even at like 97%, this plane still has excellent performance. In terms of its agility, the news is still good. It rolls pretty well at most air speeds, and as long as you don't get sucked into like a 200km/h slow crawl scissor fight, its dogfight performance is at least average at most altitudes. If your ACM is on point, you can tangle one-on-one with most opponents pretty easily, but just watch out for Zeros, Spitfires, and Yak 3s. You can use the combat flaps up to about 380 km/h, but as always, try to limit them for brief periods of just a few seconds at a time. There are a couple of caveats though. The rudder locks up pretty bad in high-speed dives, the energy retention isn't great in some situations, especially in like pure vertical loops, and the engine's supercharger can be a little weird at super low altitudes, so treetop flying isn't as strong as it might be in other planes. One standout feature that I want to mention is the landing gear of all things. The gear on the Corsair won't rip until over 700 kilometers an hour and creates an enormous amount of drag. You can see in some of the clips I used that the landing gear actually works really well as an air brake to control your speed in a dive, and it might feel goofy to be throwing your gear out during a boom and zoom attack, but trust me, it works. When you take the F4U-4 into air battles, you've got some big advantages that you can use. Mainly, its strong rate of climb and its good engine performance. It's fairly easy to set yourself up for boom and zoom diving attacks, and don't forget that landing gear dive brake. Plus, the excellent high-speed agility makes it easy to transition from diving in to conventional dogfighting. Just try to remember your strong engine power, and don't hesitate to disengage or run away if you're getting dogpiled by more opponents than you can handle at once. The main issue in air combat is the guns. The firepower of the 6 machine guns is a little below average for this BR, and a lot of your opponents are going to have at least a pair of 20mm cannons. This can leave the F4U a little more vulnerable to snapshots, and also require it to get more time on target to bring down heavier threats. One of the reasons that I usually prefer the universal belt is that it ends up being a lot better at setting fires, and letting you just move on to other targets while the guy you were shooting burns up. But the downside is that people steal your kills, and you'll somewhat frequently be getting assists instead of kill credit if you don't focus fire the target down into the dirt. Some folks like to take the high-velocity aerial rockets and salvo fire them at bombers, which is great when it works, but just remember they're horribly inaccurate. When it comes to ground attack, the F4U-4 is a perfectly capable strike fighter in the game, just like it was in real life. You can use this for a bit of ground pounding in air battles, but if you do, just keep in mind that the flight performance is going to suffer until you drop the ordnance. Flying close air support is, unsurprisingly, also perfectly viable. You don't get the huge tiny TIM rockets that later models of the Corsairs can carry, but the 1,000-pound bombs are savage if you've got a good aim with them. Remember, you can use the landing gear as a dive brake to make pretty accurate dive bombing attacks. Visually, the F4U-4 is just a great looking plane, like all the Corsairs. The 3D model is great, and the dark blue paint job it gets is totally classic. I've always been a huge fan of the Corsair family, and if the blue paint isn't really your thing, there are tons of skins up on War Thunder Live. Landing is actually a little tricky. Now, you can drop gear at basically any speed, and landing flaps can go down at about 250 kilometers an hour, but the problem is the nose-high landing profile. You have to pitch up very far in order to get the rear wheel down, and on a carrier, it almost feels like you have to stall out pulling up at minimum airspeed in order to get the hook to catch. This is one of the harder prop fighters to land, and it might be worth practicing. The cockpit on this plane is just outstanding. You sit pretty high up with great visibility, an easy-to-use gun sight, and clear instrumentation. This is easily one of my favorite prop fighter cockpits, and I have a blast with this thing in VR. To close out on the F4U-4. This plane has a very strong engine. It gets tons of ammo, has good weapons for ground attack, the landing gear is invincible and doubles as an air brake, and it's better in dogfights than you might expect. However, the snapshot firepower of the 6 machine guns is pretty low, and the engine can overheat if you're not careful. The final verdict on the F4U-4 Corsair is that this plane is an incredibly strong performer at its tier. It's easy to learn and makes a very strong addition to any mid-tier American lineup. Highly recommended. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one.